This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that have stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always, it's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, marketing stories, release stories, production stories, all those ingredients, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast, they lean towards the mainstream, really. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Don't really want to do much snark, don't really want to do much punching down. I just want to salute, really, how difficult it is sometimes to make a film, to get it through the system. And this film is a celebration of that. This podcast is a celebration of that, if anything. I talk about two films in every episode, and I think I've waffled enough, really. Should we crack on? I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer of the first of them, and I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
You don't have to chase me.
From 20th Century Fox.
He set me up. He set me up.
And DreamWorks Pictures.
Who's the victim? I've never heard of him, but I'm supposed to kill him in less than 36 hours.
He's coming here to get her.
Tom Cruise.
I need your help. If you contain information, I need to know how to get at it.
In a Steven Spielberg film.
I have to know. I have to find out what happened in my life. You tell me, who was it that set this up?
I don't know.
How about now?
On June 21st, everybody runs.
I love you.
No, time!
Minority Report.
So I've given you a slightly longer version of the trailer than usual, just because how many film trailers have used that piece of music, originally from Aliens, composed by the late, great James Horner. Well, Minority Report did, so let's start there. The 2002 movie, directed by Steven Spielberg, based on a short story by Philip K. Dick. The screenplay in the end was credited to Scott Frank and John Cohen. Tom Cruise in the lead role as Chief John Anderton, leading an ensemble that include Max von Sydow, Samantha Morton, Colin Farrell, and, well, an awful lot of futuristic technology as well. I should note that Tim Blake Nelson is also in the cast for this one, the brilliant Tim Blake Nelson. So it was in the aftermath, really, of the release of 1990's Total Recall that Hollywood had its second wave of Philip K. Dick enthusiasm. That it was Dick's short story, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, that inspired Total Recall. Of course, he also wrote the story behind Blade Runner, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And he'd written over 100 stories and short stories, but it was Total Recall being a huge smash hit. Well, it's that Hollywood thing. Whenever there's a hit, let's go and find another one from pretty much the same source. In this case, the short story Minority Report was first published in 1956 in the magazine Fantastic Universe. And chatting to the website Philip K. Dick fans, it was writer and producer Gary Goldman who started the ball rolling on what became Minority Report, albeit a good decade or so before we saw it. Now, he'd done some script work on Total Recall, the 1990 version, and he'd been working with Paul Verhoeven on that movie, and he worked for about 8-9 months on Total Recall, doing well enough rewrite work that the Writers Guild of America would give him credit on the final screenplay of the movie. Now, it was in 1992 then, a year or two after, well, 2 years after Total Recall came out, that Gary Goldman took out an option on the short story Minority Report, that he'd been shown the story by a friend, and he had the idea to direct a low-budget take on it himself. Now, keen to get a bit more momentum behind it, he took the idea for Minority Report to Paul Verhoeven, to director Paul Verhoeven, with a view to him being something like executive producer or something, just to help get the project going. But Verhoeven saw something in this one, and to the point where he thought, well, this could be Total Recall 2. Now, Verhoeven was in the midst of doing Basic Instinct at this point, which Gary Goldman also did some work on. But Gary Goldman thus went away, and he was keen, he had the option, but he was keen that his take on the film wouldn't ignore the story that Philip K. Dick had written, even though it would need to be changed to accommodate it being a screenplay. So along with Ron Shusett and Robert Goethals, he fashioned the first screenplay to the movie. Now, Goldman had form for screenplays even before Total Recall. I mean, Big Trouble with Little China is one of his credits, for instance. The script got to a point where it was completed, and what do you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger was interested in doing Total Recall 2, that this would pick up the adventures of Doug Quaid from that movie and take him on another journey. So there you had Paul Verhoeven, who was interested, you had Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was interested, then you had Carol Coe, who'd financed Total Recall, who'd financed Terminator 2 Judgment Day as well, and they were going to put up the money. So this one just seemed like a no-brainer, a straightforward home run, no problem whatsoever. Yeah, right. So Verhoeven then decided at this point, well, he wanted to go and make a film called Showgirls instead, which I will come to on a future podcast, I'm sure. So keen to keep the project moving, Gary Goldman then sought out another director, and he got in touch with Jan de Bont. Now, this was, de Bont, I've talked before on this podcast about what a legendary director of photography really he was with action cinema, and his directorial debut, a film called Speed, yep, covered that before, well, this was just about to come out, and so Goldman started talking to de Bont about directing Minority Report. Speed, of course, became a huge hit, and again this project looked like it was up and running. The problem, though, at this point was Carol Coe, because even though it had had a string of big hits, I mean, Terminator 2, Total Recall, Cliffhanger, it didn't feel much of the benefits of them, and it was being dragged down by an awful lot of debt, and to the point where when it made Cliffhanger, it had to sell off most of the back end of it, so it didn't really benefit massively when that film became a huge hit. So what Carol Coe did, it decided to gamble on a film called Cutthroat Island. Originally, it was going to star Michael Douglas. Rennie Harlin, who'd done Cliffhanger, was going to direct it, but Douglas ultimately would drop out. Matthew Modine would step in, and Gina Davis would take the lead role in that. But Cutthroat Island was being made against a backdrop, really, of Carol Coe running out of money. Harlin, for instance, shot all the second unit stuff on that film because there was just no budget to bring in someone else to do it. And the ramification of this was a bunch of projects that Carol Coe was juggling fell by the wayside. That it was going to do Crusade with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Paul Verhoeven as well. Minority Report, or Total Recall 2 as it was, well, that was one of them. And so the rights went back to Goldman and Shusett, Ron Shusett at this point. But crucially for the project, Arnold Schwarzenegger was still interested in making this one. Jan de Bont was still interested as well, and he was going off to make a small film by the name of Twister, which would turn into a monster hit for executive producer Steven Spielberg and Michael Crichton as well. Goldman was doing work with 20th Century Fox on the first X-Men movie, and that in itself is a hell of a story. But Fox was keen to listen to Goldman's other ideas, particularly Minority Report, and it liked the idea. But what Fox didn't want to do was buy the rights to Total Recall, which were becoming available because of Carol Coe's impending bankruptcy. So a couple of options in front of Fox. It could pay up to make Total Recall 2 and just make Minority Report as that, or it could just do Minority Report as a standalone project. And what it decided to do was fairly obviously the latter, and thus at that point this ceased to be the further adventures of Doug Quaid. Arnold Schwarzenegger was out. Jan de Bont's still interested though, and Goldman and Shusett was still on board as well. So with Fox backing the film, they went off and wrote a couple of extra drafts parts of the screenplay that refashioned it away from being Total Recall 2 and into something close to the Minority Report that we got. But Fox was now steering the project, Fox was paying, and Fox was pretty much in charge. So it decided it wanted a different screenwriter involved, and it hired a man by the name of John Cohen, and he went off to do a page one rewrite of the script, basically relegating Goldman and Ron Shusett to executive producers on the final movie, but seemingly with little to no more creative input in the project at this point. So by now it was coming up to about 1997. But crucially, what Cohen's script did was unlock some of the things that would lead to Minority Report actually happening. So Jan de Bont was still involved. He was trying to lure Tom Cruise to the project at this point, but de Bont's career was about to have a couple of bumps. That Speed had been a huge hit, Twister had been a huge hit, Speed 2 coming out in 1997. Well, let's just say that didn't help. De Bont also then went off to direct The Haunting for Steven Spielberg's DreamWorks company in 1999, and ultimately it was, the story goes, it was The Haunting that cost him the Minority Report job. That the film came out, even though it was commercially okay, the film came out as a disappointment, was battered by the critics, and not many people actually liked his take on that. As a result, it got to the point where Spielberg's company decided it no longer wanted de Bont involved. Now, in the backdrop of all of this, Tom Cruise and Steven Spielberg, well, they'd known each other, I think it's pretty well known, since Cruise had broken through with the film Risky Business, and they'd been looking for a project to do together for some time. It was primarily Spielberg that was going to Cruise with ideas. I mean, the closest they came to working together before Minority Report was on the film Rain Man, which Spielberg had been due to direct and worked on for the best part of 6 months, but he had a commitment to do Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, so he had to leave Rain Man. In came Barry Levinson, won Best Picture, but I don't think Spielberg could quarrel too much with how well Indy 3 turned out. But there's a couple of other projects that they nearly came close to making as well. That there was a Western called Arkansas that they looked at. They at one stage were going to do The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, that ultimately was made with David Fincher and Brad Pitt a lot longer down, a fair amount down the road. A human cloning film called Spares was also in the mix, but Cruise was now committed to making a film for Stanley Kubrick, Eyes Wide Shut, which would infamously shoot for 18 months, 2 years, with Kubrick's perfectionist approach to directing that film cutting a massive hole in Cruise's schedule. One of the knock-ons of that was that Mission Impossible 2 would end up shooting far later than had originally been planned, and that in turn was about to knock on to Minority Report as well. But he had lots of time while he was making Eyes Wide Shut, and he read the script again to Minority Report, had a look, and this time he was interested, and he sent a script to Spielberg. It had usually been the other way round, but this time Cruise had got a project, Spielberg took a look at it, and it's also worth noting as well that by the time the film was heading into proper development, about to get the green light, well, but by that stage both men were going to need a hit. That Eyes Wide Shut, he's jumping a little bit ahead in the story, but Eyes Wide Shut, well, that didn't do big business, nor did it sweep the Oscars as many had thought it might. Vanilla Sky, which Cruise would go on to do, pretty much the same. That it was one of his most divisive films, and his star power still got it to a decent opening and decent box office take, but nonetheless it wasn't ranked as a slam dunk hit. Cruise did shoot Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, for which he got a Best Supporting Actor Oscar nomination in the midst of all of this. Spielberg, though, would go off and do the film AI, the Kubrick link again there. That this was a project that infamously Stanley Kubrick developed for a long time, handed over to Steven Spielberg, and in the aftermath of Kubrick's death, Spielberg would ultimately write the screenplay to AI and would tackle that as his next film. The problem was AI ultimately didn't catch fire at the box office either, and Spielberg in an interview with Total Film would say he felt people were put off with that one by not knowing whether it was E.T. 2 or The Terminator. But anyway, let's go back a little bit, because once Cruise had sent the script to Spielberg, Spielberg was interested, and as he went off to make AI, he brought in another screenwriter to do a fresh draft of the script, and this man was Scott Frank. Now, Scott Frank at this point had had a success with Out of Sight, terrific movie that. More recently, he's hit gold with The Queen's Gambit on Netflix, but he was hired to do a new draft of the Minority Report screenplay. He reportedly went back over old drafts this time as well, in writing drafting the script. There had been at this point, because at this point it became known that Spielberg was involved in the project, there was a degree of pushback. Could Steven Spielberg really tackle the sci-fi darkness of a Philip K. Dick story? But he threw himself into it. Now, the whole project actually got to a place where in the autumn of 1999, it could have gone before the cameras then, but this is where that kind of schedule, the schedule traffic jam kicked in, because the delay to Eyes Wide Shut meant that crews had to go to the delayed Mission Impossible 2, and as such, at the same time, Spielberg decided he had to make AI at that point. That was the moment for it. And so, as a result, that meant the production of Minority Report, to which Cruise and Spielberg were both committed by this point, that would have to knock on 18 months, 2 years. This wouldn't shoot until 2001. And in fact, it was AI absorbed Spielberg, and to the point where Cruise had time to do Vanilla Sky before he came to the shoot of Minority Report. In fact, he would go pretty much straight from the set of Vanilla Sky. I think that he barely had a week between the projects onto Minority Report. But also there were ramifications to the casting of the movie as well, that if the film had been made in 1999, then I think it's pretty well known that the role of Agatha, played by Samantha Morton in the end, would have gone to Cate Blanchett. Matt Damon would have taken on the Colin Farrell role in the film. Also in the midst of this, just to give you a flavour of the other film Spielberg was juggling, this was around the time too that he turned down the chance to direct the first Harry Potter movie, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Sorcerer's Stone if you're in the US. But one result of the delay was it allowed an awful lot more development time than had originally been expected to bring Minority Report to the screen. Now, I think it's pretty well known that the final cut of Minority Report has some incredible futuristic tech in it, and the way that Tom Cruise uses the visual interfaces in the movie, it was pretty groundbreaking. But this was the result of an awful lot of work, and producer Bonnie Curtis said that structuring this complicated story was a very daunting task, and Steven Spielberg wanted to weave a psychological thriller through it. So during this development process, he took great care to get all the layers of the story just right. And she argued, in some ways, I think this is the most complicated film that Steven has ever made. And what that actually meant in practice was, years before this one went before the cameras, Spielberg and his team assembled a group of futurists and scientists, got them round a table for 3 days to basically spitball what did they feel the year 2054 might look like. So Spielberg wanted to set the film there, and he felt it was futuristic but not a zillion years away. As such, much of what we'd see on screen would be relatable, but the tech would have moved on. And their conversations, and back to Bonnie Curtis, she said that the conversations went through everything from advances in medicine to how people would brush their teeth. They looked at futuristic transportation, to urban planning, to architecture, to art. But Curtis said Spielberg wanted backgrounds that we were familiar with, that we could relate to, and within the context of the familiar, have spectacular props. Now, the thing that really came through from that group of futurists was the gradual loss of privacy was the near unanimous prediction that they came up with. And so Scott Frank said this: the reason is not so people can spy on you, but so they can sell to you. And that would underpin the design work on the movie that a man called Alex McDowell would take on. And Scott Frank would say, in the not too distant future, it is plausible that by scanning your eyes, your whereabouts will be tracked. They will keep track of what you buy so they can keep on selling to you. I mean, it sounds very remote and not at all possible, right? Now, in my previous job, actually, I spoke to Alex McDowell, the designer of the movie, and he talked about the use of contemporary architecture, really, in a futuristic movie. And McDowell told me that one of the things that Spielberg was pointing out correctly was that we all live in yesterday's future. We're not living in crazy sci-fi buildings. We're living in buildings that were 100 years old. And so, set against that, I mean, McDowell had to put his sets together for this one, and he knew that Spielberg didn't tend to walk through his sets until he was nearly ready to shoot, to keep him fresh, to keep him alert. And so that brought with it a special kind of pressure that, whilst obviously he would be kept abreast of the development, he wouldn't set foot on the actual set until, a couple of weeks before he actually needed them. And the story was that on the sets for AI, he wasn't happy with when they did that, and the team had 2 weeks basically to change them and turn them round. With Minority Report, as it would happen, he would like the sets and he would be happy, and McDowell would go on to direct the enormous set for the put together the enormous set for the Terminal. Maybe that's a story for another time. But in Minority Report as well, an awful lot of details in what they built, or just things that the camera never saw. McDowell was one who really talked up the fact that the delay to the movie helped it, and he said the huge advantage we had on the film was that we had a lot of prep time. There was no script when we started, and there was no script for a year, but we were given, almost as a result of that, the opportunity to develop the interior logic of all of these things and really test it properly. And he said, as opposed to the regular deadline that might have been 4 or 5 months before shooting, we were more like 15 months of prep before we started shooting in 2 sections. Now, one of the things that they did on Minority Report, utterly groundbreaking at the time, is they pretty much pre-visualised everything. Now, this is commonplace now, that particularly on futuristic movies and effects-driven movies, that you have a previs structure so that on the set you know how it's going to look. Minority Report, though, was very much ahead there in the vast bulk of this film was pre-visualized digitally, and again that goes to the fact that the technology was basically overmapping an awful lot of what was being physically shot on a set. Now, before it finally got to the point where it was ready to shoot, the Spielberg schedule freed up, Cruise's schedule freed up, and a union of Spielberg's DreamWorks Pictures and 20th Century Fox would come together to fund a movie that was going to cost $100 million. John August came in, did a script polish on it, and it's worth noting that there was a version of the screenplay here that was R-rated with a far darker ending, but it was Fox really that was pushing that for something more PG-13. It wanted a summer blockbuster, and this changed dramatically the ending to the movie that we ultimately got. And there's a feeling, I agree with it, the ending is the weakest part of Minority Report. I've got an awful lot of time for this movie, but there was a very different denouement to it, and you can look that up online. I'm not going to spoil it here. So filming would begin in March of 2001. So a couple of years after, really, it was all of the key personnel were in place, or at least personnel that could have got the film moving. A huge futuristic set was built at Warner Brothers' Burbank studio in Hollywood. There was, production started on March 22nd, 2001. The list of locations included the Ronald Reagan Federal Building, that was in Washington. There are hotels and plazas in Washington as well. They shot on location in Southern California, in Los Angeles. They found an abandoned shopping mall. They used sound stages not just at Warner Brothers but also at Universal and Fox, and really to get the scale of the stuff that was being built and put together. I mean, that gives you an idea, really. It's worth noting as well that this was a film heading into a summer where a Star Wars movie was coming. That the box office champion of the summer of 2002, for that was when Minority Report was targeted for, was widely expected to be Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, directed by Spielberg's old friend George Lucas. And inevitably, even as the film was going into production, there was some degree of press chatter about these two old chums making competing sci-fi movies, but there was insistence, really, that tonally they were really quite different. Spielberg, in fact, went into this one, and it's talked about in Richard Schickel's book, Spielberg, where they don't talk about Minority Report for a lot, primarily because Schickel is fairly open about the fact he's not that keen on the film. But he said that Spielberg wanted his film and the look and the feel of the film to question how many of our civil liberties are we willing to give up because the government tells us we have to in order to protect us from terrorism in the shadow, the aftermath of 9/11, which, of course, at the point this was being made, was very fresh. And he said he wanted to make sure that his film at its highest level was asking about free will. He wanted to question, does the government have the legal right literally to put you out of commission for the rest of your life because of a murder you haven't committed, but that the government is certain you will? And so this goes to the core of what Minority Report is about. The precognitives, including the character of Agatha, predict future crime. Tom Cruise's agent, he goes out and arrests people for committing crimes they haven't committed. Spielberg argues, left to her own devices, Agatha as a precog could rule the world, and he really wanted to capture that. Not that he was being massively open during the production or during the build-up to it either, because this was a secretive shoot, and it helped that it was in the shadow to a degree of Attack of the Clones, because that's where an awful lot of press attention was. When it actually came to the physicality of putting the movie together, Cruise, as per usual, would do an awful lot of his stunt work, and Spielberg would liken Cruise's work ethic to that of Tom Hanks, who he'd worked with on Saving Private Ryan, was about to work with him on on Catch Me If You Can. I mean, it's worth noting that Spielberg was doing back-to-back projects here. He would go straight from Minority Report into Catch Me If You Can. In fact, Cruise nearly came to Minority Report late because Vanilla Sky overran as well. So, I mean, there's a whole conflation of things going on here. But that work ethic of being on the set early and really rolling your sleeves up, and in fact, the pair of them would go on to work together again, which I'll talk about just shortly. The way it was going to be shot, though, I mean, there was a clear effort to give it some distinction. I wonder if the fact that Star Wars was coming out and was bright and colourful and glossy did inform that a little bit, because Spielberg was collaborating with one of his regular cinematographers, Janusz Kaminski, and they decided that the film was going to be shot on high-speed film. Spielberg really wanted this to be very grainy. He wanted the look of the film, and he talked about this in interview with Total Film after its release, but he wanted the look of the film to feel almost a little bit old-fashioned, that he wanted the contradiction that you've got this futuristic looking movie, but it's really quite grainy and tactile. At least that's how it feels. Spielberg also wasn't a fan of shooting on digital video, which was really starting to come into its own at the start of the 2000s. And for a change on this one as well, Spielberg productions generally come in just under budget and ahead of schedule, but this one was really quite taxing to get in the can. It got to the point where he had to cancel planned appearances at a couple of film festivals, Venice and Deauville, just to be able to get this one filmed and ready anywhere close to on schedule. It's worth noting as well that the two core names at the heart of it, and the two names really that were going to power it, Steven Spielberg and Tom Cruise, when it came to the promotion, both of them had, at Spielberg's advice really, deferred their salary on it, in part to keep the budget down, but both as a result of that, we're going to take a significant slice of the back end. That 100 million budget might have come down as a result of the pair taking pretty much scale up front, but they were going to take 10-15% each of the gross afterwards. Fortunately, there was some product placement in place on this. You might notice it if you see the film. I mean, $2 million from Nokia came in, $5 million from Lexus. There were lots of companies who wanted their products to be in a futuristic movie, and the film's designers work closely with these companies to make sure they're pretty seamlessly integrated in it all. I mean, advertising is a big part of Minority Report. The long shoot would ultimately draw to an end on the 18th of July 2001, and this did leave a generous amount of post-production time, that the film wouldn't come out until the following July, so it gave Spielberg a year to put it together, but he would spend a chunk of that time developing and getting Catch Me If You Can moving as well. But there are a couple of things they did in post-production as well. I mean, firstly, Spielberg trimmed the film back to get that PG-13, that bits of violence were pulled back, a couple of bits of fruity language were taken out as well. But Kaminski also did an effect on the film stock. So it's when Spielberg made Saving Private Ryan, in post-production, what they did is an effect that basically drained the colour out of the film, took 60% of the colour out of it. In the case of this one, what they did is something called they basically did a bleach bypass on it. So I had to quote someone on this because I don't fully get it. It said effectively skipping the bleaching of the silver halide crystals in the film in order to create desaturated silver tinted colours, and there is a distinctive visual palette and colour scheme really to Minority Report, but that was achieved by using physical film stock and applying effects to it in post-production. And so what this allowed Spielberg to do was not desaturate the colour as per Saving Private Ryan, but to keep things like the reds and greens prominent, but bring down the skin tones of the characters. And again, it went back to, here is a look that plays against the fact that it was futuristic. Now, that year of post-production, of course, would involve an awful lot of visual effects work as well, that as much as things have been pre-visualized, as much as things have been shot working with that previous footage, what they're actually putting on screen was incredibly difficult. Look at Tom Cruise playing with lots of visual graphical user interfaces to get to what he needs, and the speed at which he does it, that was also crucial to the challenge that they were facing. When it came to actually selling it, though, there was another slight problem here, because AI had been sold heavily off the back of Kubrick and Spielberg, and it hadn't really worked, and so there was a question mark, will the name Spielberg really carry this one? Fortunately, when it came for the marketing department, Mission Impossible 2 had been a huge hit. It finally came out the year before Minority Minority Report a while later than a while after it had been originally planned for release. I think I've covered that in a previous podcast as well. But it hit big, so Tom Cruise was the safest thing to hang this on. But as you recall from the trailer I played you at the start, by the time it came close to release, they were happy to sell this heavily off the back of Cruise and Spielberg and not worry too much about explaining the plot, because right up to the release, unless you are familiar with the Philip K. Dick story, of which it bears a passing resemblance, I think that's fair to say, they're not going for full-on authenticity. And nonetheless, bottom line, by release date, most people just knew it was a futuristic film with Tom Cruise in it and Steven Spielberg in it, and a well-received film as well. I mean, critically, it was well received. I mean, it's that the Star Wars film that came, Attack of the Clones. Now, looking back, that's a heavily derided film. It's worth noting that it wasn't at the time. I lived through reading the reviews to Attack of the Clones, and lots of them were positive. It had been out for 6 weeks though by the time Minority Report opened at number 1 at the US box office on the weekend of June the 21st to the 23rd, 2002. It opened alongside Lilo and Stitch from Disney. What a great film that is. Lilo and Stitch actually sold more tickets, but Minority Report topped the box office because it sold more adult price tickets. So 35.6 million opening weekend, not to be sniffed at. That was considered a good result. It would go on to do 132 million in the US, 226 million overseas, overall box office $358 million. That was seen as a success. So a couple of things off the back of that. First of all, Spielberg and Cruise were keen to work together again. Even whilst Minority Report was being made, Cruise was talking in interviews about how he was working on a project called War of the Worlds, and he would lure Spielberg to that. That would be their final collaboration. Story goes, they didn't quite get on as well in the aftermath of that one. There was also, I mean, there wasn't any sign of a Minority Report 2, but there was a Minority Report TV series that would follow. That came out a bit more recently. But in terms of where it sits in early 2000 cinema, I would suggest that history's been kinder to it than it has been to Attack of the Clones. And whilst Minority Report is a long film, too long a film, I think that's an easy conclusion to draw. It's nearly 2.5 hours, and whilst the last 20 minutes doesn't add to the movie and its weakest point, and loads of critics really pointed this out, I think the idea of making a futuristic film and grounding it in the world of today to some degree really paid dividends. And that brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories. I'm thrilled as well that my sponsors are back. The lovely folks at Mutiny Shaving, well, they continue to support my work. I mean, if you can check out their social media at Mutiny Shaving, they have a posh hashtag, which I don't. Their hashtag is Join the Mutiny. They have a website, mutinyshaving.co.uk. They bill themselves as the most eco-friendly shaving company on the planet, and given that my face is currently covered in unkempt facial hair, I need some eco-friendly products to sort that out, and well, I might just give Mutiny Shaving a go. Why not? If you like this podcast, I'm an independent podcast producer. I've got a small favour to ask. I'm a nerd in a room, really, talking into a microphone without a big company or anything posh like that. I rely on your word of mouth, basically. If you like this podcast, please subscribe at your podcast repository of choice. Also, if you can leave a review, ideally a hugely positive review, that helps me enormously and helps with all the posh algorithms, again, that I don't understand. But, I just need all the help I can get, and I hugely appreciate your support. Onwards then, let's move on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. We're going back to 1990 this time. Play you a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
This is absurd.
Go ahead, play cool. I know. You killed her. You're the guy.
Why didn't you tell me about you and Carolyn?
This is my life. We're not talking about some gossip.
Indeed, you will go to trial.
You're still in love with her.
How can you think that I could do a thing like that?
Oh, he sounds very growly there, doesn't he? That's not a clip from the trailer for 1990's Presumed Innocent, directed by Alan J. Pakula, based on the novel by Scott Turow. The screenplay in the end was credited to Frank Pearson and to Alan J. Pakula. The cast, led by Harrison Ford, also with Brian Dennehy, Raul Julia, Bonnie Bedelia in the midst there, and Greta Scacchi in the pivotal role of Carolyn Polimas. Now, this one goes back to, inevitably, the novel on which it was based, at a point where legal thrillers weren't really box office as far as book sales were going, really. But Scott Turow, well, he was a former prosecutor and he turned to writing. Several would follow in his wake, but it would be fair to say he did a degree of the pathfinding in the mid to late 1980s. So legal thrillers, again, not top of the bestseller chart, but he put his heart and soul into his debut novel, an ambiguous thriller by the name of Presumed Innocent, and the buzz around it began even a year before the book itself had been published. So the book was published in August of 1987, and it would become a sensation, and a very fast sensation. It was his debut novel, though, and the book circulated around Hollywood a year before, in the summer of 1986, and a bidding war soon began for the rights to the movie. And I mean, you get a flavour of just how wanted it was by the people who were involved in that bidding war. So producer Richard D. Zanuck, for instance, he would actually win an Oscar for a film he made in 1990, Driving Miss Daisy. He'd been nominated for Academy Awards for The Verdict and for Jaws, and he liked the look of this one. In went a bid of $75,000 for it. Not bad money by mid-1980s standards. But then in came Paramount Pictures, and it was interested as part of the deal it had with legendary producers Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer, who made Top Gun for the studio, Flashdance for the studio, and they were the go-to producers under the deal that they had at Paramount. The price thus went up to $300,000 when Simpson and Bruckheimer became interested in bringing Presumed Innocent to the screen. But more legendary producers came in. John Peters and Peter Guber, Batman, will go on to run Sony Pictures, but they weren't put off when the price started to go close to $1 million. By this point, Simpson and Bruckheimer were out. That amount was too rich for Paramount. MGM came in, had a sniff around, but in the end, it was Sidney Pollack, producer and director Sidney Pollack, who would secure the rights, stumping up $1 million for the privilege, a huge amount of money to secure a book at that point. As Scott Turow would say, he told the Los Angeles Times, "I sold the rights to a classy guy, Sidney Pollack, and I knew he'd see it became a classy movie," which it did. Now I'm spoiled, I'd like to see that happen again, which actually didn't, but we'll come to that a bit later down the line. But there were other bids in and around the amount that Sidney Pollack was putting forward, but Scott Turow trusted Sidney Pollack to do the project right. And so, as Turow said, during the bidding war for the rights, everyone was saying it'll be an easy film to make, and this was the message from Hollywood. But the structure of the book of Presumed Innocent was really quite complex, written in the first person, a lot of ambiguity, not a particularly nice character, really, the lead character in the film, Rusty Sabich, and so he wasn't as convinced, and as he said, "Gee, I don't know your business, but it doesn't look easy to make to me." And these would be pretty wise words, really. The book, at the point the film rights were secured, well, then it was published, became this huge success, made Turow millions, sold millions of copies, especially when it hit the paperback. I think it sold 712,000 hardbacks, 4.3 million sales in paperback. Now, Pollack entertained the idea of directing this film himself. However, he would ultimately decide to cede the director's chair, decide just to produce this movie, and he had a conversation with a legendary director, lots of legends here, Alan J. Pakula. Now, by this stage, other studios had kind of given this one a little bit of a wide berth just because of the cost of it. That United Artists were going to make it at one stage, but ultimately it was Warner Brothers that came in and picked the project up, and $20 million it was going to cost to make for a courtroom thriller, and that really wasn't on the cheap side. So, at the point Pollock secured the rights, he did bring in a screenwriter before he brought Pakula in. He brought in a writer by the name of Frank Pearson, who'd done the 1970s version of A Star is Born, amongst his other work. And he would talk about the development of the script in an interview with Empire magazine back in 1990. And he said, I first started to work on it with Sidney Pollock, and it was going to be a story about sexual obsession, a violent, bloody and erotic picture. Then, when Alan J. Pakula took over, he wanted to do it as a story about justice, about truth and lies, which was a 180-degree turn. And one of the, this goes to the impact that Pakula would have on the project once he decided to jump aboard. I mean, one of the key things is that the decision was made to never show the murder. That's at the heart of the movie. And so Pakula came to the project off the back of films such as Clute, Sophie's Choice, All the President's Men. I mean, hugely acclaimed films, but drawn to moral ambiguity. And he then, he would have to do an awful lot of work on the script, which I'll come to shortly. But also, it was he who was having to deal with how do you cast this movie? And a few names were mulled, really, because this was going to be a big film. That much was clear. And as such, it was going to need a big name. Now, Kevin Costner was reportedly sought for the role at one point. He'd just broken through off the back of films like The Untouchables and No Way Out, but he reportedly passed on it. Now, the name of Robert Redford was sounded. Now, there are two differing stories here. Either Redford turned the story down, or Pakula ultimately felt that Redford was too old to take on the character of Rusty Savage. Instead, Pakula was drawn to Harrison Ford. That he kind of figured he needed a star name, but a star name who could come across in an everyman role. And so Ford was coming off the back of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, mentioning that again this podcast. But in particular, it was films such as Witness, Frantic and Working Girl that really opened Pakula's eyes to what Ford could do. That in the 80s, even though he was a huge movie star off the back of Star Wars, off the back of the Indiana Jones films, he'd sought out and played impressive roles in dramas as well. And so Pakula went to Ford's ranch in Wyoming to talk about the project. Scott Turow was a little bit about the idea of casting Harrison Ford in the film until he saw the film Frantic, and then it was just like, oh, okay. And so in that chat at Ford's ranch, it was as always, Ford was interested in this one, but he wanted to wait for the script. He knew, though, that this wasn't going to be a flashy role. He knew that this was going to be the kind of role where, if anything, the action was going to take place around him. It was a bit of a gamble, really, for a movie star, in a film where, even as the script was written, he would just be sat down for a good chunk of the movie as the story played out around him. But wrestling that script, even with Harrison Ford interested in it, that was a challenge. That the book was graphic, still is graphic. It's skewed around this narrator who you wouldn't necessarily trust. And as Turow said, there were three large narrative problems to solve. Point of view, getting around the first person narrative, the time sequence, because the book is all flashback, and as he said, Hollywood doesn't like that, and then just an awful lot of plot. And there's a lot of plot. And so Turow would say, I have to give Alan a great deal of credit as both director and writer. But it took Alan J. Pakula an awful long time to wrestle this into some kind of shape. He worked with Frank Pearson, and they spent the best part of a year finding a way to basically make... It wasn't that Presumed Innocent was an unfilmable book. It was never categorised as that. It was just a very difficult film, a very difficult story to bring into a screenplay format. So they kind of went with the idea of, well, let's make it narrated documentary, if anything. But also, Pakula wanted to make some changes to key characters in the film, in particular the character of Carolyn Palimas. This would cause some controversy when it came out. But she, as he said, going back to that interview with Empire, Greta Stacchi would come in to play the role, and he said he refused to make her, quote, a bitch. And it goes on. It just says, I'm sure there are plenty of men who've slept their way to the top. The story is told through Harrison, so the audience may end up sharing the feeling he has towards Carolyn, but that doesn't mean that I, as a storyteller and director, am trying to make that condemnation. And he wanted to sympathise that character and just change the tone of a couple of characters in the movie. This was all enough in the end to convince Harrison Ford to sign on the dotted line. He would take a $7 million salary for doing so, and the announcement came in March 1989 that Presumed Innocent was going to go ahead at Warner Brothers, with Harrison Ford starring, Alan J. Pakula directing. The cast would come together, and the shoot would begin on the 31st of July 1989. But there'd be a degree of work before that as well, because before the shoot took place, Ford and Pakula would go off to the district attorney's office in Detroit, and they'd spend a week there during an ongoing murder trial just to try and get the feel and the tone of what was going on. Also, Alan J. Pakula was a director who liked to rehearse his actors, and rehearsals in the end took place over the course of 3 weeks, and the actors were encouraged to go out and research. So Raul Julia went off and spent some time with legal professionals as well. But in the midst of it all, you can't talk about Presumed Innocent without talking about this. Harrison Ford decided to get a haircut, because one of the reasons he'd taken on the role in Presumed Innocent is he wanted to change the audience expectations of what a Harrison Ford role could be. And one of the ways he decided to do that was to go and get the crew cut haircut that he got in the movie. And in fact, Kevin Costner would sport a similar one 2 years later in The Bodyguard. And both of them, I mean, the internet wasn't a thing then, but little did they know that both of them would end up on internet lists for forevermore off the back of their hair. And there was a fair degree of press attention over Harrison Ford's distinctly odd haircut in the movie. Naturally, I won't focus on it. Now, the courtroom that they built, they went to Kaufman Astoria Studios and recreated it. They'd actually found a courtroom in Cleveland that they wanted to use for the filming of Presumed Innocent, but it was being used as a court, and as such it wasn't going to be available for the duration of filming. I mean, it's worth noting, for a courtroom thriller, this one shot for 3 months. I mean, it was quite intense, the amount of work that they did on it. So they rebuilt the set for that courtroom, which was, one of the interesting things about Presumed Innocent is it's a courtroom thriller where you don't really get to the court much until the back end of the movie. Nevertheless, when it came time to shoot those scenes, they got their courtroom built. The film did actually shoot on the east coast of America, away from Hollywood, and it's worth looking at the courtroom sequences, because Gordon Willis, who came in as director of photography, they were determined not to make them look showy. They going back to that almost documentary feel that they were looking for. So one of the things that Willis did, insisted on no complex camera shifts during the court sequences of it, and as a result, when you watch Presumed Innocent, I looked at it again ahead of this podcast, there's a lot of basically famous people just sitting around in the second half of the film, and no attempt to jazz that up at all. A lot of exposition is coming out, and it's really quite bold. I think I couldn't imagine it would be approached that way now. Even though they'd also stripped away good chunks of the book, it's worth noting that the script writing was continuing right up till the end of the shoots, that Frank Pearson was reworking dialogue right to the end, and the challenge there, as again the Los Angeles Times article said, was figuring out how to dramatise Rusty's interior monologues as they were in the book, and it was a really tough task. And so the voiceovers too that were designed to bracket the film, they were changed and they were being revised right up to the last minute. There was also the fact that they wanted to keep the suspense going and keep the surprises going, and so that too really was part of the screenwriting challenge that they didn't nail until right near the end. One thing too, one of the ways that Pakula wanted to approach the film is he didn't want to romanticise the relationship at all between Ford and Scatchy's characters, and so if you look at those, all of the scenes between them really are shot almost distant, like that we're a distant observer to them rather than any kind of intimacy. They took a long time to get the courtroom sequences right, and the actors' research did pay off in the end, and the film thus went into post-production and it was ready for sneak previews. Now, the fact that a film was coming of Presumed Innocent was big news in Hollywood. There was a lot of anticipation for this, and there was also have they really cast the right person here? Can Harrison Ford, the movie star hero, the matinee hero really, pull off such a morally ambiguous role as that of Rusty? And the LA Times reports that they held previews in Pasadena in the US, and the representatives from Warner Brothers and the filmmakers were really tense. And the question was, here's nice Harrison, so often heroic. Can the audience suspect him? And if they do suspect him, will they turn against him? Because after all, he's carrying you through the story, through the film. The other thing, though, it's worth noting that they were battling, is most of the people, the feeling was that most of the people who were going to see Presumed Innocent will have likely read the book of Presumed Innocent, or knew someone who'd read the book of Presumed Innocent, and crucially, would know the ending of it. And so this was a recurring question put to the cast and crew in the build-up to the movie's release. Why would you go and see a film like this, a whodunit really, when you knew how it was going to end? And Pakula would argue, actually, that he referred to his most famous film, All the President's Men. Just like, you knew how that was going to end, but that didn't affect the level of tension in there, and that turned out all right. Also want to put a shout out in this for the score by John Williams, not known for scoring thrillers, and a little bit out of his comfort zone. I think it's quite an interesting score as well. It's not it's worth tracking down, even though it's far from one of his most famous. The reviews for Presumed Innocent, though, I mean, they were fairly in the middle in the end. I mean, there's no way of buttering that up, that it was felt that the movie had done just enough, that there was a real pushback against some of the changes that the filmmakers had made to the story as well, and that came through in some of the critical response to the film. It's also the fact that it's quite a dry courtroom thriller, really, that if you don't lock into the story of this one, there are just people just sat around just having a natter about it, and that's quite hard to get into if you're really not buying the story. Warner Brothers, though, well, it was protective of the film. It's worth noting that it asked critics, in particular, not to discuss or give away the film's ending. And there's a review from a reviewer, Jay Boyer, who was writing the Orlando Sentinel. It's a lovely quote. He said, "It's not that Warner Brothers is actually concerned that reviewers will tip the solution to the murder mystery. It's that the studio wants to further the impression that the movie is full of surprises." Ouch. It is quite a grown-up thriller, though. I would say that, and it does try and treat the audience with some degree of intelligence, but it's hard to argue with pretty much the 3-star reviews that followed down the line on this one. But didn't matter a jot when it came to the box office, because huge hit book turned into a huge hit film. That it opened in cinemas in July of 1990 in the US, and on its opening weekend, Harrison Ford had another hit on his hands. It opened to $11.7 million. Big money by 1990, certainly for a film like this. The other opener that weekend was Problem Child. Crikey, I saw that. 10 million that had. Ghost was in second place, knocked off the top spot. Others around at the time, Arachnophobia, Die Hard 2, the re-release of The Jungle Book, Navy SEALs, there's a hell of a story behind that film. Days of Thunder, so Bruckheimer and Simpson were represented nonetheless in that summer. And Presumed Innocent would go on to be a box office hit, 86 million in the end it did in the US, another 135 million overseas, worldwide gross $221 million for a courtroom thriller, and that was really good money. It sold another load of books as well, and in the aftermath of doing it, Ford in fact would commit to doing another everyman role. He would go on to make the film Regarding Henry with director Mike Nichols, and Regarding Henry at one point was going to be the film that was going to be a template for a Hot Shots sequel, but that never really came to pass. He would work with Alan J. Pakula again on a very troubled production, The Devil's Own, co-starring Brad Pitt. That in itself is a story and a half. For Scott Turow, he would continue writing books, still continues writing books. In fact, he would write a direct sequel to the book Presumed Innocent in 2010 called Innocent, but in terms of screen adaptations, well, most of his books at best went to television. There wasn't ever a film of this scale, really, at least to date, that's been mounted of his work. And also, Presumed Innocent is just the kind of film that you can't make a sequel to. Not really, anyway. And as such, it's the kind of film, I believe, that Hollywood would just kind of just look away from now. I think it would be quite a hard one to get off the ground. But it was a hard one to wrestle anyway at the time. And I don't think it's a fully successful film. I think the struggles they had with the story are evident in the 2-hour running time as they try to explain everything. But in the midst of it all, it was a gamble by Harrison Ford. It was an interesting choice of director. I think that one just about paid off. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories, again supported by the wonderful folks at Mutiny Shaving. If you want to hear more of my waffling, I'm on Twitter at Simon Brew. The entire Film Stories project is on Twitter at Film Stories Pod, facebook.com/Film Stories Online, youtube.com/Film Stories. But also I've got a new magazine out. You can find it at store.filmstories.co.uk. We go behind the scenes of Mark Kermode's Secrets of Cinema, as well as a whole host of other bits and bobs there. Working on more magazines as well. If you have a look at the store page, you'll find them. And if you look at our website, filmstories.co.uk, you get every weekday loads of news stories, features, reviews, bits and bobs like that. Finally, if you want to support this podcast, if you're a sponsor, then by all means get in touch with me, Simon at filmstories.co.uk, or if you'd like to just support us on Patreon so I can put a bit of money to help more writers break into writing for us as well, patreon.com/Simon Brew. Most important thing though, you will stay safe and you will take care of yourselves, particularly in the times that this podcast is being recorded. I hugely appreciate your ears, I hugely appreciate your time, and I will be back with you soon with another bunch of film stories. You take care. Bye bye.